Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 598, Cloven Conversion. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I just got back from driving my mom to the airport, which stinks. Actually, the drive there and back was easy peasy lemon squeezy, but it's driving your mom to the airport, and it's always more fun picking up than taking back. So, but we had a great time. We had a great time at the beach. Thank you. Zoom chats, thank you for your understanding at my evaporation. I will be back this next week. Today is the day that Thing 2, Aiden, goes to get the driver's license. We were stymied by COVID, so it was all put on hold for a really long time. Oh, on the drive to the airport today, Mom and I were talking about books. I have a list from my mom of some of the mystery writers that she has enjoyed, and some of the big ones that people have already read and talked about and that I've talked about, I didn't mention, and she didn't put on the list because already been there, done that. But these are new ones that I had not been familiar with yet. So I'm going to put this list onto the show notes so that if you are interested, you will be able to see the information there. Aside from that, Thing 2, Aiden has decided to learn how to embroider. The beach that we go to has a needlepoint and embroidery store. So I was able to get a couple of different kind of learning kits. One was crewel embroidery, which I thought might be easier, and the other was more traditional stamped embroidery. And kid took to it like a fish in water. So that was cool. It also inspired me to start embroidering on a t-shirt. One of my oldest and most beloved shirts was starting to stretch out and thin out so much that you could see the woven hard thread that the softer cotton was built around, the core of the thread that they used to make the t-shirt. That was sad, and so I've been embroidering little flowers and French knots to hold it together. I am almost done, and if it's decent and works when I am done, I will share pictures of it with all y'all on Instagram and show notes and stuff like that. So that's pretty much all that is here. I've been really lazy. The beach was lazy. That was awesome. And then this week, was just getting back into the swing of things and that, figuring out how to do normal life again after being at the beach and having that wonderful salt air in your face all the time. And that is pretty much all the adventuring on this end. But that's not the adventure for Joan. So the first chapter today, chapter 34, book 2, chapter 34, is pretty short, pretty straightforward. We've already talked a bit about the things that you are going to see happen. They are true. They did happen. They are pretty well known as part of the legacy of stories. I started to say midrash. Midrash is the Jewish stories that are parallels to the stories in the Torah. So they're not actually biblical stories, but they are stories that have been used to teach their kind of parables, but not really. The stories in our first chapter today kind of function that way. They have become part of the Joan lore. That's a better word. The second chapter today, chapter 35, is the one that we have all been waiting for. And when I say we, I mean all of us, including Joan. So it's a big deal. Mark Twain does break in at one point as the translator to update you on reality, because, of course, as somebody who is writing in the voice of somebody who was with Joan, Twain had to constrain himself to writing a narrative that fit within the lifespan of Louis. And as a consequence, had no opportunity to give us updates on the reality past Louis' lifetime. And that's where the break into the narrative comes in the form of a footnote that our reader reads to us. So listen for that. And Clovis. Clovis is going to get mentioned. I don't know jack diddly about my French history, and so I have learned that the first king to really unite, and I'm saying that with an ish in there, to pretty much unite what became France, so all of the Frankish tribes in the area, what Rome would have called Gaul, Northern Gaul. The first guy to really do that was Clovis the First. And so he's kind of an Arthurian guy, but not so much on the legends that got built up around old Clovis there. However, the really important reason for us is Clovis was the first king of France and a major convert to Catholicism in 496. His wife, Clotilde, was the one who really pushed him into doing this, and she actually became a saint because of that. Clovis was baptized on Christmas Day in 508, and you are going to hear all about Clovis and becoming the king and that. But yeah, his conversion is one of the reasons why he is certainly mentioned in this book, but also venerated in general, aside from the fact that he was just, the guy who brought everybody together, which is pretty impressive back then in the late 400s. Not for nothing. All right, so let's listen to Book 2, Chapters 34 and 35 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, written by Mark Twain and read for us by John Greenman. All right, here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 34, The Jests of the Burgundians. The campaign of the Loire had as good as opened the road to Rheims. There was no sufficient reason now why the coronation should not take place. The coronation would complete the mission which Joan had received from heaven, and then she would be forever done with war, and would fly home to her mother and her sheep, and never stir from the hearthstone and happiness any more. That was her dream, and she could not rest, she was so impatient to see it fulfilled. She became so possessed with this matter that I began to lose faith in her two prophecies of her early death, and of course when I found that faith wavering I encouraged it to waver all the more. The king was afraid to start to Rheims, because the road was mile-posted with English fortresses, so to speak. Joan held them in light esteem, and not things to be afraid of in the existing modified condition of English confidence. And she was right. As it turned out, the march to Rheims was nothing but a holiday excursion. Joan did not even take any artillery along, she was so sure it would not be necessary. We marched from Gien 12,000 strong. This was the 29th of June. The Maid rode by the side of the king. On his other side was the Duke d'Alençon. After the Duke followed 3 other princes of the blood. After these followed the Bastard of Orleans, the Marshal de Boussac, and the Admiral of France. After these came La Hire, Saintré, Tremouille, and a long procession of knights and nobles. We rested 3 days before Auxerre. The city provisioned the army, and a deputation waited upon the king. But we did not enter the place. Saint-Florentin opened its gates to the king. On the 4th of July we reached Saint-Phal, and yonder lay Troyes before us, a town which had a burning interest for us boys, for we remembered how 7 years before, in the pastures of Domremy, the Sunflower came with his black flag and brought us the shameful news of the Treaty of Troyes, that treaty which gave France to England, and a daughter of our royal line in marriage to the butcher of Agincourt. That poor town was not to blame, of course, yet we flushed hot with that old memory, and hoped there would be a misunderstanding here, for we dearly wanted to storm the place and burn it. It was powerfully garrisoned by English and Burgundian soldiery, and was expecting reinforcements from Paris. Before night we camped before its gates, and made rough work with a sortie which marched out against us. Joan summoned Troyes to surrender. Its commandant, seeing that she had no artillery, scoffed at the idea, and sent her a grossly insulting reply. 5 days we consulted and negotiated. No result. The king was about to turn back now and give up. He was afraid to go on, leaving this strong place in his rear. Then La Hire put in a word, with a slap in it for some of his Majesty's advisers. The Maid of Orleans undertook this expedition of her own motion, and it is my mind that it is her judgment that should be followed here, and not that of any other, let him be of whatsoever breed and standing he may." There was wisdom and righteousness in that. So the king sent for the maid, and asked her how she thought the prospect looked. She said, without any tone of doubt or question in her voice, "In 3 days' time the place is ours." The smug chancellor put in a word now. "If we were sure of it, we would wait her 6 days." "6 days, forsooth! Name of God, man, we will enter the gates tomorrow." Then she mounted and rode her lines, crying out, "Make preparation! To your work, friends, to your work! We assault at dawn." She worked hard that night, slaving away with her own hands like a common soldier. She ordered fascines and faggots to be prepared and thrown into the fosse, thereby to bridge it, and in this rough labor she took a man's share. At dawn she took her place at the head of the storming force, and the bugles blew the assault. At that moment a flag of truce was flung to the breeze from the walls, and Troy surrendered without firing a shot. The next day the king, with Joan at his side and the paladin bearing her banner, entered the town in state at the head of the army. And a goodly army it was now, for it had been growing ever bigger and bigger from the first. And now a curious thing happened. By the terms of the treaty made with the town, the garrison of English and Burgundian soldiery were to be allowed to carry away their goods with them. This was well, for otherwise how would they buy the wherewithal to live? Very well. These people were all to go out by the one gate, and at the time set for them to depart we young fellows went to that gate, along with the dwarf, to see the march out. Presently here they came in an interminable file, the foot soldiers in the lead. As they approached, one could see that each bore a burden of a bulk and weight to sorely tax his strength, and we said among ourselves, truly these folk are well off for poor common soldiers. When they were come nearer, what do you think? Every rascal of them had a French prisoner on his back. They were carrying away their goods, you see, their property, strictly according to the permission granted by the treaty. Now think how clever that was, how ingenious. What could a body say? What could a body do? For certainly these people were within their right. These prisoners were property. Nobody could deny that. My dears, if those had been English captives, conceive of the richness of that booty. For English prisoners had been scarce and precious for 100 years, whereas it was a different matter with French prisoners. They had been overabundant for a century. The possessor of a French prisoner did not hold him long for ransom, as a rule, but presently killed him to save the cost of his keep. This shows how small was the value of such a possession in those times. When we took Troy, a calf was worth 30 francs, a sheep 16, a French prisoner 8. It was an enormous price for those other animals, a price which naturally seems incredible to you. It was the war, you see. It worked two ways. It made meat dear and prisoners cheap. Well, here were these poor Frenchmen being carried off. What could we do? Very little of a permanent sort, but we did what we could. We sent a messenger flying to Joan, and we and the French guards halted the procession for a parley, to gain time, you see. A big Burgundian lost his temper and swore a great oath that none should stop him. He would go, and would take his prisoner with him. But we blocked him off, and he saw that he was mistaken about going. He couldn't do it. He exploded into the maddest cursings and revilings then, and unlashing his prisoner from his back, stood him up, all bound and helpless, then drew his knife, and said to us with a light of sarcastic triumph in his eye, "I may not carry him away, you say? Yet he is mine, none will dispute it. Since I may not convey him hence, this property of mine, there is another way. Yes, I can kill him. Not even the dullest among you will question that right. Ah, you had not thought of that, vermin." That poor starved fellow begged us, with his piteous eyes, to save him, then spoke, and said he had a wife and little children at home. Think how it wrung our heartstrings. But what could we do? The Burgundian was within his right. We could only beg and plead for the prisoner, which we did, and the Burgundian enjoyed it. He stayed his hand to hear more of it, and laugh at it. That stung. Then the dwarf said, "Prithee, young sirs, let me beguile him. For when a matter requiring permission is to the fore, I have indeed a gift in that sort, as any will tell you that know me well. You smile, and that is punishment for my vanity, and fairly earned, I grant you. Still, if I may toy a little, just a little," saying which he stepped to the Burgundian and began a fair soft speech, all of goodly and gentle tenor, and in the midst he mentioned the maid, and was going on to say how she out of her good heart would prize and praise this compassionate deed which he was about to— It was as far as he got. The Burgundian burst into his smooth oration with an insult leveled at Joan of Arc. We sprang forward, but the dwarf, his face all livid, brushed us aside and said in a most grave and earnest way, "I crave your patience. Am not I her guard of honor? This is my affair." And saying this, he suddenly shot his right hand out and gripped the great Burgundian by the throat, and so held him upright on his feet. "You have insulted the maid," he said, "and the maid is France. The tongue that does that earns a long furlough." One heard the muffled cracking of bones. The Burgundian's eyes began to protrude from their sockets and stare with a leaden dullness at vacancy. The color deepened in his face and became an opaque purple. His hands hung down limp, his body collapsed with a shiver, every muscle relaxed its tension and ceased from its function. The dwarf took away his hand, and the column of inert mortality sank mushily to the ground. We struck the bonds from the prisoner and told him he was free. His crawling humbleness changed to frantic joy in a moment, and his ghastly fear to a childish rage. He flew at that dead corpse and kicked it, spat in its face, danced upon it, crammed mud into its mouth, laughing, jeering, cursing, and volleying forth indecencies and bestialities like a drunken fiend. It was a thing to be expected. Soldiering makes few saints. Many of the onlookers laughed, others were indifferent. None was surprised. But presently in his mad caperings the freedman capered within reach of the waiting file, and another Burgundian promptly slipped a knife through his neck, and down he went with a death shriek, his brilliant artery blood spurting 10 feet as straight and bright as a ray of light. There was a great burst of jolly laughter all around from friend and foe alike, and thus closed one of the pleasantest incidents of my checkered military life. And now came Joan hurrying and deeply troubled. She considered the claim of the garrison, then said, "You have right upon your side, it is plain. It was a careless word to put in the treaty, and covers too much. But ye may not take these poor men away. They are French, and I will not have it. The king shall ransom them, every one. Wait till I send you word from him, and hurt no hair of their heads. For I tell you, I who speak, that would cost you very dear." That settled it. The prisoners were safe for one while, anyway. Then she rode back eagerly and required that thing of the king, and would listen to no paltering and no excuses. So the king told her to have her way, and she rode straight back and bought the captives free in his name, and let them go. End of chapter 34. Volume 2, Book 2, Chapter 35, The Heir of France is Crowned. It was here that we saw again the Grand Master of the king's household, in whose castle Joan was guest when she tarried at Chinon in those first days of her coming out of her own country. She made him Bailiff of Troyes now, by the king's permission, and now we marched again. Châlons surrendered to us, and there by Châlons in a talk, Joan, being asked if she had no fears for the future, said, yes, one, treachery. Who would believe it? Who could dream it? And yet in a sense it was prophecy. Truly, man is a pitiful animal. We marched, kept on marching, and at last, on the 16th of July, we came in sight of our goal, and saw the great cathedral towers of Rheims rise out of the distance. Huzzah after huzzah swept the army from van to rear, and as for Joan of Arc, there, where she sat her horse, gazing, clothed all in white armor, dreamy, beautiful, and in her face a deep, deep joy, a joy not of earth. Oh, she was not flesh, she was a spirit. Her sublime mission was closing in flawless triumph. Tomorrow she could say, "It is finished, let me go free." We camped, and the hurry and rush and turmoil of the grand preparations began. The Archbishop and a great deputation arrived, and after these came flock after flock, crowd after crowd of citizens and country folk, hurrahing in with banners and music, and flowed over the camp, one rejoicing inundation after another, everybody drunk with happiness. And all night long Rhys was hard at work, hammering away, decorating the town, building triumphal arches and clothing the ancient cathedral within and without in a glory of opulent splendors. We moved betimes in the morning. The coronation ceremonies would begin at 9 and last 5 hours. We were aware that the garrison of English and Burgundian soldiers had given up all thought of resisting the Maid, and that we should find the gates standing hospitably open and the whole city ready to welcome us with enthusiasm. It was a delicious morning, brilliant with sunshine, but cool and fresh and inspiring. The army was in great form, and fine to see, as it uncoiled from its lair, fold by fold, and stretched away on the final march of the peaceful coronation campaign. Joan, on her black horse, with the lieutenant-general and the personal staff grouped about her, took post for a final review and a good-bye, for she was not expecting to ever be a soldier again, or ever serve with these or any other soldiers any more after this day. The army knew this, and believed it was looking for the last time upon the girlish face of its invincible little chief, its pet, its pride, its darling, whom it had ennobled in its private heart with nobilities of its own creation, call her Daughter of God, Savior of France, Victory's sweetheart, the Page of Christ, together with still softer titles, which were simply naive and frank endearments, such as men are used to confer upon children whom they love. And so one saw a new thing now, a thing bred of the emotion that was present there on both sides. Always before, in the march past, the battalions had gone swinging by in a storm of cheers, heads up and eyes flashing, the drums rolling, the bands braying paeans of victory, but now there was nothing of that. But for one impressive sound one could have closed his eyes and imagined himself in a world of the dead. That one sound was all that visited the ear in the summer stillness, just that one sound, the muffled tread of the marching host. As the serried masses drifted by, the men put their right hands up to their temples, palms to the front, in military salute, turning their eyes upon Joan's face in mute "God bless you and farewell," and keeping them there while they could. They still kept their hands up in reverent salute many steps after they had passed by. Every time Joan put her handkerchief to her eyes, you could see a little quiver of emotion crinkle along the faces of the files. The march past after a victory is a thing to drive the heart mad with jubilation, but this one was a thing to break it. We rode now to the king's lodgings, which was the Archbishop's country palace, and he was presently ready, and we galloped off and took position at the head of the army. By this time the country people were arriving in multitudes from every direction, and massing themselves on both sides of the road to get sight of Joan, just as had been done every day since our first day's march began. Our march now lay through the grassy plain, and those peasants made a dividing double border for that plain. They stretched right down through it, a broad belt of bright colors on each side of the road, for every peasant girl and woman in it had a white jacket on her body and a crimson skirt on the rest of her. Endless borders made of poppies and lilies stretching away in front of us, that is what it looked like. And that is the kind of lane we had been marching through all these days, not a lane between multitudinous flowers standing upright on their stems. No, these flowers were always kneeling, these human flowers, with their hands and faces lifted toward Joan of Arc, and the grateful tears streaming down. And all along, those closest to the road hugged her feet and kissed them and laid their wet cheeks fondly against them. I never, during all those days, saw any of either sex stand while she passed, nor any man keep his head covered. Afterward, in the great trial, these touching scenes were used as a weapon against her. She had been made an object of adoration by the people, and this was proof that she was a heretic. So claimed that unjust court. As we drew near the city, the curving long sweep of ramparts and towers was gay with fluttering flags and black with masses of people, and all the air was vibrant with the crash of artillery and gloomed with drifting clouds of smoke. We entered the gates in state and moved in procession through the city, with all the guilds and industries in holiday costume marching in our rear with their banners, and all the route was hedged with a huzzaing crush of people, and all the windows were full and all the roofs, and from the balconies hung costly stuffs of rich colors, and the waving of handkerchiefs seen in perspective through a long vista was like a snowstorm. Joan's name had been introduced into the prayers of the church, an honor theretofore restricted to royalty, but she had a dearer honor and an honor more to be proud of, from a humbler source. The common people had had leaden medals struck which bore her effigy and her escutcheon, and these they wore as charms. One saw them everywhere. From the archbishop's palace, where we halted, and where the king and Joan were to lodge, the king sent to the abbey church of Saint-Remy, which was over toward the gate by which we had entered the city, for the Sainte Ampoule, or flask of holy oil. This oil was not earthly oil, it was made in heaven, the flask also. The flask with the oil in it was brought down from heaven by a dove. It was sent down to Saint-Remy just as he was going to baptize King Clovis, who had become a Christian. I know this to be true. I had known it long before, for Père Front told me in Domremy. I cannot tell you how strange and awful it made me feel when I saw that flask and knew I was looking with my own eyes upon a thing which had actually been in heaven, a thing which had been seen by angels perhaps, and by God himself of a certainty, for he sent it, and I was looking upon it. At one time I could have touched it, but I was afraid, for I could not know but that God had touched it. It is most probable that he had. From this flask Clovis had been anointed, and from it all the kings of France had been anointed since. Yes, ever since the time of Clovis, and that was 900 years. And so, as I have said, that flask of holy oil was sent for, while we waited. A coronation without that would not have been a coronation at all, in my belief. Now, in order to get the flask, a most ancient ceremonial had to be gone through with. Otherwise the Abbé of Saint-Remy, hereditary guardian in perpetuity of the oil, would not deliver it. So in accordance with custom, the king deputed 5 great nobles to ride in solemn state and richly armed and accoutred, they and their steeds, to the abbey church as a guard of honor to the Archbishop of Rheims and his canons, who were to bear the king's demand for the oil. When the 5 great lords were ready to start, they knelt in a row and put up their mailed hands before their faces, palm joined to palm, and swore upon their lives to conduct the sacred vessel safely, and safely restore it again to the church of Saint-Remy after the anointing of the king. The archbishop and his subordinates, thus nobly escorted, took their way to Saint-Remy. The archbishop was in grand costume, with his mitre on his head and his cross in his hand. At the door of Saint-Remy they halted and formed to receive the holy vial. Soon one heard the deep tones of the organ and of chanting men. Then one saw a long file of lights approaching through the dim church. And so came the abbot, in his sacerdotal panoply, bearing the vial, with his people following after. He delivered it with solemn ceremonies to the archbishop. Then the march back began, and it was most impressive, for it moved the whole way between 2 multitudes of men and women who lay flat upon their faces and prayed in dumb silence and in dread, while that awful thing went by that had been in heaven. This august company arrived at the great west door of the cathedral, and as the archbishop entered, a noble anthem rose and filled the vast building. The cathedral was packed with people in thousands. Only a wide space down the center had been kept free. Down this space walked the archbishop and his canons, and after them followed those 5 stately figures in splendid harness, each bearing his feudal banner, and riding. Oh, that was a magnificent thing to see! Riding down the cavernous vastness of the building through the rich lights streaming in long rays from the pictured windows. Oh, there was never anything so grand! They rode clear to the choir, as much as 400 feet from the door, it was said. Then the archbishop dismissed them, and they made deep obeisance till their plumes touched their horses' necks, then made those proud, prancing and mincing and dancing creatures go backward all the way to the door, which was pretty to see, and graceful. Then they stood them on their hind feet, and spun them around, and plunged away and disappeared. For some minutes there was a deep hush, a waiting pause, a silence so profound that it was as if all those packed thousands there were steeped in dreamless slumber. Why, you could even notice the faintest sounds, like the drowsy buzzing of insects. Then came a mighty flood of rich strains from 400 silver trumpets, and then, framed in the pointed archway of the great west door, appeared Joan and the King. They advanced slowly, side by side, through a tempest of welcome, explosion after explosion of cheers and cries, mingled with the deep thunders of the organ and rolling tides of triumphant song from chanting choirs. Behind Joan and the King came the paladin and the banner displayed, and a majestic figure he was, and most proud and lofty in his bearing, for he knew that the people were marking him and taking note of the gorgeous state dress which covered his armor. At his side was the Sire d'Albret, proxy for the Constable of France, bearing the sword of state. After these, in order of rank, came a body royally attired representing the lay peers of France. It consisted of 3 princes of the blood, and La Tremouille and the young de Laval brothers. These were followed by the representatives of the ecclesiastical peers, the Archbishop of Rheims, and the bishops of Laon, Chalon, Orleans, and one other. Behind these came the grand staff, all our great generals and famous names, and everybody was eager to get a sight of them. Through all the din one could hear shouts all along that told you where 2 of them were. "Live the Bastard of Orleans! Satan la hire forever!" The august procession reached its appointed place in time, and the solemnities of the coronation began. They were long and imposing, with prayers and anthems and sermons, and everything that is right for such occasions, and Joan was at the King's side all these hours with her standard in her hand. But at last came the grand act. The King took the oath. He was anointed with the sacred oil. A splendid personage, followed by train-bearers and other attendants, approached, bearing the crown of France upon a cushion, and kneeling offered it. The King seemed to hesitate, in fact, did hesitate, for he put out his hand and then stopped with it there in the air over the crown, the fingers in the attitude of taking hold of it. But that was for only a moment, though a moment is a notable something when it stops the heartbeat of 20,000 people and makes them catch their breath. Yes, only a moment. Then he caught Joan's eye, and she gave him a look with all the joy of her thankful great soul in it. Then he smiled, and took the crown of France in his hand, and right finely and right royally lifted it up and set it upon his head. Then what a crash there was! All about us cries and cheers, and the chanting of the choirs, and groaning of the organ, and outside the clamoring of the bells and the booming of the cannon. The fantastic dream, the incredible dream, the impossible dream of the peasant child stood fulfilled. The English power was broken. The heir of France was crowned. She was like one transfigured, so divine was the joy that shone in her face as she sank to her knees at the King's feet and looked up at him through her tears. Her lips were quivering, and her words came soft and low and broken. "Now, O gentle King, is the pleasure of God accomplished according to his command, that you should come to Rheims and receive the crown that belongeth of right to you, and unto none other. My work, which was given me to do, is finished. Give me your peace, and let me go back to my mother, who is poor and old, and has need of me." The King raised her up, and there before all that host he praised her great deeds in most noble terms, and there he confirmed her nobility and titles, making her the equal of a count in rank, and also appointed a household and officers for her according to her dignity. And then he said, "You have saved the crown. Speak, require, demand, and whatsoever grace you ask, it shall be granted, though it make the kingdom poor to meet it." Now that was fine. That was royal. Joan was on her knees again straightway, and said, "Then, O gentle King, if out of your compassion you will speak the word, I pray you give commandment that my village, poor and hard pressed by reason of war, may have its taxes remitted." It is so commanded. Say on." "That is all." "All? Nothing but that?" "It is all. I have no other desire." "But that is nothing, less than nothing. Ask. Do not be afraid." "Indeed I cannot, gentle king. Do not press me. I will not have aught else, but only this done." The king seemed nonplussed, and stood still a moment, as if trying to comprehend and realize the full stature of this strange unselfishness. Then he raised his head and said, "Who has won a kingdom and crowned its king, and all she asks and all she will take is this poor grace, and even this is for others, not for herself. And it is well, her act being proportioned to the dignity of one who carries in her head and heart riches which outvalue any that any king could add, though he gave his all. She shall have her way. Now, therefore, it is decreed that from this day forth Domremy, natal village of Joan of Arc, deliverer of France, called the Maid of Orleans, is freed from all taxation forever." Whereat the silver horns blew a jubilant blast. There, you see, she had had a vision of this very scene the time she was in a trance in the pastures of Domremy, and we asked her to name the boon she would demand of the king if he should ever chance to tell her she might claim one. But whether she had the vision or not, this act showed that after all the dizzy grandeurs that had come upon her, she was still the same simple, unselfish creature that she was that day. Yes, Charles VII remitted those taxes forever. Often the gratitude of kings and nations fades, and their promises are forgotten or deliberately violated. But you who are children of France should remember with pride that France has kept this one faithfully. 63 years have gone by since that day. The taxes of the region wherein Domremy lies have been collected 63 times since then, and all the villages of that region have paid, except that one, Domremy. The tax-gatherer never visits Domremy. Domremy has long ago forgotten what that dread sorrow-sowing apparition is like. 63 tax books have been filed meantime, and they lie yonder with the other public records, and any may see them that desire it. At the top of every page in the 63 books stands the name of a village, and below that name its weary burden of taxation is figured out and displayed, in the case of all save one. It is true, just as I tell you. In each of the 63 books there is a page headed Domremy, but under that name not a figure appears. Where the figures should be, there are 3 words written, and the same words have been written every year for all these years. Yes, it is a blank page, with always those grateful words lettered across the face of it, a touching memorial, thus: Domremy, rien, la pucelle. Nothing, the Maid of Orleans. How brief it is, yet how much it says! It is the nation speaking. You have the spectacle of that unsentimental thing, a government, making reverence to that name and saying to its agent, "Uncover and pass on, it is France that commands." Yes, the promise has been kept. It will be kept always. Forever was the king's word. Note 1. It was faithfully kept during 360 years and more. Then the overconfident octogenarian's prophecy failed. During the tumult of the French Revolution the promise was forgotten and the grace withdrawn. It has remained in disuse ever since. Joan never asked to be remembered, but France has remembered her with an inextinguishable love and reverence. Joan never asked for a statue, but France has lavished them upon her. Joan never asked for a church for Domremy, but France is building one. Joan never asked for saintship, but even that is impending. Everything which Joan of Arc did not ask for has been given her, and with a noble profusion, but the one humble little thing which she did ask for and get has been taken away from her. There is something infinitely pathetic about this. France owes Domremy 100 years of taxes, and could hardly find a citizen within her borders who would vote against the payment of the debt. Note by the translator. End of Note 1. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon the ceremonies of the coronation came at last to an end. Then the procession formed once more, with Joan and the king at its head, and took up its solemn march through the midst of the church, all instruments and all people making such clamor of rejoicing noises as was indeed a marvel to hear. And so ended the third of the great days of Joan's life. And how close together they stand, May 8th, June 18th, July 17th.
All right, man. So Dauphin is no longer Dauphin. Dauphin is king. We now have Charles VII. We've been waiting. Joan had been waiting. Joan's done, right? All is good. Woohoo! So now what? Indeed. Now what? See, cliffhangers. So the thing about the taxes, as Mark Twain told you, is real. It was the French Revolution that ended that. Don't get me started. Super sad, right? The one thing that she asked for, she didn't get. She got sainted, but Domremy still has taxes for the last however many years, 200 years plus. So that's kind of stinky. But nonetheless, Joan managed to get everybody where they needed to get to for the coronation ceremony. None of the troops interfered with them all the way through our chapters today. They got to Rheims. They were able to do the ceremony. It was a big deal. And it was Joan who did it. It just kind of blows my mind, I guess, that this was able to happen and that it's not fiction. I'm blown away. It's pretty cool. The last Joan thing I have for you before we go is Andrew turned me on to the fact that Catherine J. Chen, Chen, has written Joan, a novel of Joan of Arc. And Hilary Mantel, who we know and love from Wolf Hall, etc., wrote this blurb. It is as if Catherine J. Chen has crept inside a statue and breathed a soul into it, recreating Joan of Arc as a woman for our time. She is a genius, but also a child, an icon, but also vulnerable and human. Chen's novel brings home to us the strangeness of Joan's story as well as its appeal, which is timeless, without borders, and always fresh. So, Zeitgeist, there you go. We were waiting for it, and now it's arrived. So if you are interested in knowing more from a historical fiction point of view about Joan of Arc, which would be very, very different, obviously, from Mark Twain's version, which is a little bit more reportage, outside person, not first person narration, not even necessarily third person omniscient, but just straightforward telling of the beats of Joan's life. Here you go. Joan, a novel of Joan of Arc by Catherine J. Chen, recommended to you by Hilary Mantel. Go figure. All right, that's it for me today. It is a late start for me, but I wanted to make sure you got your chapters today. I will talk to you soon. Be well, take care of each other, wear a mask, get a booster. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.